Everybody, welcome. Good morning if you're joining us from the US. Good evening if you're joining us from China. And there might be people joining us from all over the world. So hello to everybody. Welcome. My name is Devin Lau. I'm the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing. And I'm very happy to host today Professor Daniel Markovits for our talk on the meritocracy trap. I know that everybody's really excited, and so I'm glad to have so many of you joining us. First, if those of you guys that are joining us on Zoom, if you would turn on your webcams, that would be great. It would be great to be able to see some of you and to see who we're talking with. And I know that a lot of you are also joining us from a live stream as well, so welcome to you. And a special thank you to our co-hosts, CITIC Press, who are the Chinese publishers of Professor Markovits' book, translator and publisher. I'm very thankful for their partnership. And for those of you guys that are on Zoom, we will be taking questions in about halfway through. And so we're happy to take questions, and we'll select five
Mm.
of the questions that are asked for to receive a copy of the book as well. And so there's a lot to discuss today, and so I'm going to quickly introduce our speaker and then turn things over to him. So Professor Daniel Markovits is the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School, as well as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. He earned his bachelor's in mathematics from Yale before studying in England on a British Marshall Scholarship, where he was rewarded a master's in econometrics and mathematical economics from the London School of Economics, as well as a BPhil and DPhil in philosophy from the University of Oxford, where he then, after that, returned to Yale to study law and has clerked for the Honorable Guido Calabresi and then joined the faculty at Yale. He publishes widely and in a wide range of disciplines, including law, philosophy, and economics. His writings have appeared in Science, the American Economic Review, the Yale Law Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, Atlantic, a whole host of places. And in 2021, Prospect Magazine named him to its list of the world's top 50 thinkers. His current book that we'll be discussing is The Meritocracy Trap, which I'll let him get into. And so, without further ado, Professor Daniel Markovits.
Great. Thank you, Devin. Thank you all for being here. I believe it is either early in the morning for you or late at night for you. So I'm especially grateful that you're here. I will speak for maybe 30 minutes and hope that we can have a conversation for the second half of the hour. And one way to set up what I'm going to say is just to observe that there's a remarkable divergence of perspective about the elite between those who are inside it and those who are outside it. If you're inside the elite right now, in certainly in the wealthy West, but also increasingly in the increasingly wealthy East, what you see is a system that is working extremely well. You look around you and you see a range of hardworking, talented, accomplished people from all backgrounds and all walks of life who are striving and largely succeeding to accomplish difficult goals. If you look at the elite from outside of the elite, what you see is something completely different. You see a callow and self-indulgent elite that has been incompetent in its management of our societies. If you just look at the United States over the past 25 years, the US American elite gave us the Gulf War. Then it gave us the financial crisis. Then it gave us the first election of Trump and Brexit. Then it gave us COVID and the mismanagement of the pandemic. Then it gave us the second election of Trump. And you see point and point again an elite that is just not performing well and that has significantly lost its legitimacy. And so when you have a situation in which those who are inside a system of norms view it as operating extremely well, and those who are outside of the system of norms view it as having lost all of its appeal and legitimacy, one way to explain what's going on is that that system of norms is self-defeating. And that's going to be the theme of this talk. So let's just start by introducing how meritocracy works, And the basic idea is that meritocracy allocates advantage based on individual and therefore variable accomplishments, rather than on fixed group-based identities like race or gender or class. So you get ahead based on your own achievements, not based on some identity that you were born with. Um, our meritocracy today, which is different from other meritocracies, for example, the ancient Chinese meritocracy, measured accomplishment in terms of erudition and classical learning. Our meritocracy measures accomplishment based on human capital, which is built in competitive schools. It's measured by test scores and grades. And importantly, it's rewarded in competitive labor markets. So it's priced by wages. So the merit someone has is closely connected to the wage that they can command in the labor market. The idea here is that meritocracy will render the inequality and hierarchy that every society has to have, particularly large, complex societies, in order to manage itself. Some people have to lead, some people have to follow. But meritocracy renders that inequality acceptable in a democratic society. The thought is that meritocracy makes hierarchy democratically okay. You can see this throughout certainly the European world. Here are some early meritocrats who described what they were doing, all in terms of Emile Boutmy is the most striking of these. The idea was that the upper classes might preserve their political hegemony by invoking the rights of the most capable. And Boutmy thought this was necessary to manage France out of the decay of the old aristocratic prerogatives. This view of meritocracy has two central virtues. The first is everybody gets a fair chance of getting ahead. Obviously, not everybody can be from a preferred gender or religion or race. Not everybody can have elite parents. But no subgroup has a monopoly on talent and effort. And so the thought was that if people could advance based on their own accomplishments, then everybody would have a shot at advancing. Um, the idea was to open a previously closed elite to deserving outsiders. And the people who opposed meritocracy understood this and opposed it for that reason. Yale University is a case study. When Kingman Brewster became president of Yale in the 60s and was the first president to make Yale anything resembling a meritocracy, declaring he did not intend to preside over a finishing school on Long Island Sound, he hired someone whose name was Inky Clark, Inslee Clark, was his given name. Inky was his nickname. Who had the advantage of having what sounded like an old waspy name, but was actually a child of recent immigrants, I think from the Bronx. And Inky Clark remade the admissions process to create a statement, he said, about what leadership was going to look like in this country and where leaders were going to come from. And the people who were against meritocracy understood shamelessly that this was going on and they objected to it. Bill Buckley preferred that the old WASP be admitted over the high achieving, hard working Mexican American from the Southwest. A member of the Yale Corporation said no Jews, no public school graduates, should all be Protestants, all old white men. They lost, of course, and the new Yale was born. And throughout the rich countries of the world, a similar path opened up positions in the elite to people who had previously been excluded, independent of their own personal accomplishments, based simply on their race or their gender or their class. One of the reasons why meritocracy initially was so successful was that, the old elite, the old aristocratic elite, to be blunt, was not very hardworking and it wasn't very smart. If you inherit your privilege and position, there's no reason to strive and there's no need to be good at anything. But meritocracy, this is its second central virtue, is it claims that it produces an energetic, capable, and productive elite whose talents serve the common good, even as they do well for the meritocrats themselves. Again, the old aristocracy was not like this. It understood itself in Torsten Veblen's language as a leisure class. That is to say, it self-consciously constituted itself in terms of not needing to work for a living. The meritocrats had a different view. Meritocrats are always hungry. They're seeking to reconstitute their status in every generation through their own talent, effort, and industry. And Yale was again a case study. One of the reasons why Inky Clark's new admissions policy succeeded is that they thought of themselves as finding the best investments for the education that Yale would provide. Brewster said he was an intellectual investment banker. Clark talked about talent searching. And this made a transformative difference into who the elite was. The new meritocratic elite is much, much more diverse than the old aristocratic elite ever was. Moved from Yale to Princeton in the United States, didn't produce its first black graduate until 1947, didn't include women until 1973. Today, Princeton is half people of color and half women. The Cravath Law Firm had exclusively Christian men from its founding in 1819 until 1958. Today, it's run by a woman of Pakistani origin. You can see this throughout the elite, especially in the United States, but actually throughout the elite in many of the rich countries in the world. And what this shows you is that meritocracy was initially an enormously egalitarian force. If you look outside of the very elite in the United States based on race, in 1960, if you were a black man in America who was earning in the top tenth of the black distribution of wages, you would be at or below the median of the white distribution. And the reason was that there was no meritocracy and categorical racial exclusion prevented African Americans from getting any of the high-paying jobs. Today, the black man in the 90th percentile of the black distribution would be at the 75th percentile of the white distribution, which shows that there's still significant race-based discrimination. But it's very different from what the situation was like in 1960. And again, this is important, actually. This is a sideline, but for current disputes about diversity in education and diversity in hiring and affirmative action, the number one reason why, in the US at least, the elite is much more diverse than it used to be is meritocracy. It's that previously there were a series of categorical exclusions of African Americans, of women, of Jews, of Catholics, of Muslims, of Asians, who could not get in no matter how accomplished they were. And when we shifted to a meritocracy, those groups started getting admitted. They started getting admitted to schools, to universities, and they started getting hired in jobs. And it may be that today affirmative action on the margins pursues diversity through unmeritocratic means, but the central mechanism of the diversification of the elite has been meritocracy. The meritocratic elite is also much more capable and much more industrious. This is a striking fact just about Yale again. The median SAT score of a Yale student today would put them in roughly the top 5% of the class of 1961. So the average student today would have been a superstar in 1960. Again, because the old aristocrats weren't very hardworking, they weren't very smart. And in fact, it used to be the case at Yale in the 1960s when they accepted a few public school kids. If you wanted to know who the most capable students at Yale were, it was not the kids who attended Exeter or Andover or the St. Paul School. It was the kids who attended Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, the small number of meritocratic outsiders who were admitted. Whereas today, all the kids are meritocrats in some sense. Moreover, as grown-ups today, the meritocratic elite owes its income to its labor. As recently as 1960 in the United States, the highest 1% of earners by household got only about a third of their income by selling their labor. Today, they get close to three-quarters of their income by selling their labor. So the old aristocratic elite, the leisure class, has been replaced by a superordinate working class. That's where the elite gets its money from in the United States today. Again, meritocracy opened up the elite, and it also created an elite that does well, as it were, by doing good. Today in the United States, the richest 1% of households work nearly 7 hours more per week than they did in 1950. And today in the United States, a prime age working man in the top fifth of the wage distribution is more than twice as likely as someone in the bottom fifth to work over 50 hours a week. That's a complete transformation of social structures. For almost all of human history, if you wanted to know how poor someone was, you simply asked how long they worked. And the longer they worked, the poorer they were. Today, the longer you work, the richer you are. And again, this is a system in which what meritocracy did is it achieved initially these two central virtues. One, it created or promoted equality of opportunity. It gave everybody a chance at getting ahead. And two, it created a hardworking elite that, as it served its own interests, also promoted the common good. And those were the two powerful arguments in favor of meritocracy. So, how does meritocracy unravel? How does it defeat itself today? Well, first, it undoes each of these two virtues. It defeats the virtues that once recommended it. Today, meritocracy blocks rather than promoting equality of opportunity. And today, the meritocratic elite's ambition no longer serves the common good. Let me explain both of these. First, how does meritocracy today block equality of opportunity? Well, the old aristocratic elite, being not very hardworking and being not very smart, lacked both the inclination and the capacity to educate its children. But the meritocrats who won the first round of the competition are different. They have an almost unmatched skill at training their children and an effectively unlimited appetite for buying education. Inequality in education consumption has been the fastest growing sector of inequality of consumption in the rich nations of the world over the past 50 years. In the US, for example, today, a typical public school might spend $12,000 to $15,000 on educating one of its students. A poor state might spend $8,000 to $10,000. But a really elite private school spends $75,000 a year educating each of the kids who goes there, and roughly 80% of those kids come from the top 5% of the income distribution. So notice something striking here. The gap between what's spent on a typical really, really rich kid and what's spent on a typical middle class kid is about 15 times bigger than the gap between what's spent on a middle class kid and what's spent on a poor kid. And that produces enormous differences in childhood achievement. The gap between middle school achievement at the 90th percentile and the median income, which is the blue line, has been rising steadily over the past 50 years, even as the gap between the median child and a child in the 10th percentile, so below the poverty line, has been shrinking. And the gaps are very, very large. The rich-poor achievement gap for US American children, which is shown by the red line, is now greater than the white-black gap was in 1954. Now, 1954 is the year Brown against Board of Education was decided. So economic inequality today, because the elite spends so much on training its children, is producing bigger differences in middle and high school academic achievement than apartheid did at the middle of the last century. Once again, the biggest gaps are between the rich and the middle class, not between the middle class and the poor. On the SAT, a typical student, the average student whose parents make more than $200,000 a year, roughly again the top 5%, maybe the top 8% of the income distribution, and a middle class student, a median student, is about 250 points. Whereas the gap between the average SAT score of a median student, a middle class student, and a student at or below the poverty line is only 125 points. So the rich middle class gap is twice as big as the middle class poor gap. Right? This produces an extremely skewed elite. This is the odds of going to college in America today based on your parents' income rank. And the only sort of more strikingly unequal opportunity in this is the quality of the college you go to based on your parents' income rank. And again, if you look at the most elite colleges, the 150 or so most competitive colleges in America, kids whose parents are in the top quarter of the income distribution are overrepresented in those student bodies compared to kids in the bottom quarter by a factor of 14 to 1. In a way, that's not surprising. Elite institutions have never admitted the poor. But today in America, kids from the top quarter are also overrepresented compared to kids from each of the two middle quarters by a factor of 6 to 1. So the elite is squeezing out not just the poor, but also the middle class. And at the most elite colleges, the skew to wealth is even greater. There have been recent years in which in the Ivy Plus colleges, there have been more kids from the top 1% than the bottom half. And at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford, there have been more kids from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. And let me add two important points here. The largest reason for this is meritocratic. I took a recent year of the SAT and I asked how many kids were there in America, high school seniors, one of whose parents had a graduate or professional degree, whose SAT score was at the Ivy League median. And the answer was well over 5,000. And then I asked how many kids were there, neither of whose parents had graduated high school, whose SAT score was at the Ivy League median. And the answer was, well, the statistics became unreliable because the tail is so thin, but if you ground out the number, the answer was 32. So if there are 32 kids in America, neither of whose parents have a high school degree, whose SAT score is at the Ivy League median, and the Ivy League does meritocratic admissions, it's not going to have a lot of kids in it whose parents didn't graduate high school. Right? Now, here's a way to think about this. The way in which the old aristocrats passed on their privilege to their children is simply by dying. Lord so-and-so would die, and Lord so-and-so's eldest son would become Lord so-and-so and inherit the estate. The way in which meritocrats pass on their privilege to their children is not by dying, but by investing in education while the parents are still alive. So let's conduct the following thought experiment. Let's try to construct the size of the meritocratic inheritance by asking, let's take the difference between what's devoted to educating a typical child from a one percenter household in the United States today and what's devoted to educating a typical middle-class child, not a poor child, but a middle-class child. And let's invest that money each year in the S&P 500 to be given to the rich child as a bequest when the parents die. That meritocratic inheritance would amount to between $10 and $15 million per child. Right. These investments pay off. The returns to education, and particularly elite education, are incredibly high. The US wage structure is segmented by education. Only about 1 in 75 high school dropouts, only about 1 in 40 workers with no education beyond high school, and only about 1 in 6 workers with a BA only will accumulate lifetime earnings equal to the median professional school graduates. Not an elite professional school graduate, but the median professional school graduate. Elite professional school graduates have much, much, much higher earnings. The median Yale Law School graduates income 25 years out. I know this because I had a student with journalism background um, figure out the income of every Yale Law School graduate of the class of 2000. The median income is over $1 million a year. American elites are dominated by 12 universities. And so what's happened is we've created a new kind of aristocracy. It's just not based on birth and land and breeding. Instead, it's based on human capital and training. And the college rankings have become our Debrett's peerage and baronetage. And in that sense, meritocracy is self-defeating with respect to the first of its virtues, because the competition, which was embraced to promote equality of opportunity, has today become the single greatest obstacle to equality of opportunity. Now let's talk about the second virtue. Remember, meritocracy's second virtue is that it creates an elite that serves the public interest even as it serves its own private interest. Right? Well, there's been a second shift over the past 50 years, which is there's been a massive shift of work and income away from middle-class workers and in favor of super skilled, superordinate workers. All right. Here you can just see average weekly hours worked by income rank in the United States since 1940. And as you can see, the purple line, which is the top 1%, shows, as I mentioned earlier, that the richest 1% of Americans today work about 7 hours a week more than they did in 1940. The red line shows that the bottom 60% of the distribution works about 9 hours fewer than it did in 1940. So this is a shift of work hours away from the bottom 60% and in favor of the top 1% of about 16 hours per week, which is 2 work days a week. So there's been a massive shift of the opportunity to work away from the middle class and towards the elite. And the reason for this is not that the middle class and poor in the United States don't want to work. It's that the economy doesn't give them any jobs. Routine jobs, which are here, the ones in the middle of this figure, you can probably see the cursor moving around. Those are mid-skilled middle class jobs. And over the past 30 or 40 years, roughly a third of those jobs have disappeared, even as elite jobs have exploded. So the economy is no longer giving middle class Americans enough to do. And that's one of the reasons why middle class Americans aren't working as long hours as they used to. Even as the economy is incredibly dependent on elite Americans, which is one of the reasons why they're working much longer. It's also the case that wages are tracking this. Here's just a nice little chart that shows you the ratios of incomes between the more elite worker and the less elite worker who work side by side in the same office. And as you can see, what's happened over the past 60 years is that there's been an explosion in the inequality of those wages. The claim about the CEO to the production worker is familiar, that in 1960, CEOs earned only about 20 times what an average production worker earned, whereas today they earn about 300 times as much. But it's not just CEOs. It's elite finance workers. It's elite lawyers. It's doctors compared to nurses. In every sector of the economy, the elite workers are now earning a much, much larger multiple of the wage of the non-elite worker than they did just 60 years ago. Why has this happened? The answer is skill bias technological innovation. The technologies that we use to make goods and deliver services have changed, and they've changed in such a way that new technologies are complements for elite skills. They make elite skills more desirable, more valuable, more necessary, and they're substitutes for middle class skills. They make middle class skills irrelevant and therefore less highly paid. Why do the technologies favor skilled workers? Well, there are lots of reasons, but the central reason has to do with the distribution of the education structure in the country and in the world. New technologies didn't always favor skilled workers. In the first industrial revolution, for example, new technologies were biased against skilled workers. What the factory system did is it allowed unskilled factory workers to replace highly trained artisans. That's why, for example, in England, the Luddites, who were the initial anti-innovation political movement, were skilled weavers who objected to what they called scribbling machines, which were industrial type looms that allowed unskilled people to weave just as well, and actually engaged in a campaign of sabotage to try to stop the use of the looms. So the first industrial revolution was biased against skill. Why was it biased against skill, and why is the technology today biased in favor of skill? Well, look, inventors choose their inventions to mix with the other resources that are available in society. And so when you have a large labor supply, inventors will choose what to invent based on the nature of the labor supply that can use their inventions. This has always been true. In early agriculture, just to give you an idea, societies that lived in the desert invented drip irrigation, where societies that lived in floodplains invented paddy field farming. So the technology of agriculture that was invented depended on the nature of the natural resources that were available. Well, today we live in a world in which the greatest resource is not natural, it's human capital, it's human resources. And that's going to make it inevitable that the technologies that are invented depend on the nature of the human resources that are available. The reason why the first industrial revolution favored unskilled workers is that the inventors of the early 19th century confronted a new mass of unskilled labor. These were people moving to the cities in England and eventually people fleeing the Irish potato famine. And there was this mass of unskilled workers, and so people invented new technologies of production that might exploit it. Today, we have a new mass of super skilled workers, precisely because of the meritocratic transformation in education. Remember, I said the old elite wasn't very hardworking, it wasn't very smart. Well, the new elite is very smart and very hardworking, which means it's an incredibly valuable labor force. And new technologies were invented to exploit that labor force. And that's the reason why elite wages have exploded. Now, you can show this in sector after sector in really close detail. Perhaps the easiest way to show it is to look at finance. Today, finance workers are among the most educated and highest paid workers in the economy. That actually wasn't true before about 1975. In the 60s, the English magazine The Economist wrote an article asking whether banking was the world's most respectable dying industry. Finance workers in the 50s and 60s were not better educated than the rest of the workforce. They were not more highly paid than the rest of the workforce. And when the finance sector grew, it grew simply by adding more mid-skilled middle class workers. So what happened? Well, in the 60s, the US invested enormously in training engineers and physicists because it was in the space race against the Soviet Union and more broadly in the Cold War. And US policy decided we needed engineers and physicists to promote our national security in the face of those threats. Then, by the late 60s and early 70s, the US had won the space race, and détente ended or slowed the arms race. And suddenly there were many, many more engineers and physicists than could be used in the industries for which they had been trained, namely space and armaments. And so the question is, what was going to happen with these people? For a while, it looked like the chemical industry was going to absorb them, but the chemical industry turned out not to need them. And so what happened instead is that financial innovators and legal innovators took basic economic ideas that had been around for at least 20 years and to some degree for 200 years and retooled them to be practically implementable so that highly trained technical physicists and engineers could work in finance, deploying these financial technologies to produce enormous returns using relatively fewer workers. Wall Street old guard called the initial high-tech finance workers in the 80s rocket scientists. And the reason they called them that is that they were rocket scientists. They were rocket scientists who had been trained to send people to the moon and were no longer necessary, and they now designed derivatives and traded various kinds of asset-backed securities and created modern portfolio design and modern portfolio theory. And as you can see in this figure, look at the blue line and the red line. Starting in about 1980, finance's share of GDP keeps going up and up. But whereas until about 1980, finance's share of employment had risen together with GDP, starting in 1980, finance's share of employment just flatlines and even diminishes. So what happened is, whereas from 1950 to 1980, finance grew by adding more workers, starting in 1980, finance grew without adding more workers. Why did it do that? Well, now look at the purple and green lines. The relative education of finance workers started exploding at exactly that time. And when the workers were fewer and more skilled, they also got paid more. And so the green line shows that finance wages started exploding. So this is a microcosm of what happened across the economy. Skill bias technical change induced by the existence of a super elite labor force transformed the technology of production to favor precisely the elite skills that these workers had, disfavor everybody else, and produce enormous inequality. So this is another way in which meritocracy became self-defeating. Because whereas the first generation of meritocratic elites were just more capable than everyone else, and they ran a more productive society, the new meritocratic elite transforms society in its own image to benefit itself rather than to benefit society as a whole. And finance is again a good example. If you look at the best economist estimates of new finance versus old finance, finance sector workers are much more highly paid than they used to be. They are much better educated than they used to be. But the transactions costs of financial intermediation have not gone down. And the share of fundamental risk borne by the individual has not gone down. In other words, finance does not provide a better service to society as a whole. Instead, finance benefits finance workers. And that's the way in which the meritocratic elite today has its own fortunes divorced from the broader. Now, notice the elite says that they deserve their income because they're so productive. But the productivity of their raw capacities depends precisely on the inequality that it's supposed to justify. And so the idea that the elite deserves its income today is just a circle. There's another way to think about this that goes really to the way in which meritocracy is now self-defeating along its second virtue. So the old idea was that meritocracy squares elite advantage with the common good. Because the idea is when you measure how much one person contributes to society, you ask what's the difference between the total social product when that person works and when that person doesn't work. But you imagine that in the world in which that person doesn't work, everybody else keeps doing exactly the same thing that they were doing in the world in which they did work. And in that world, even today's meritocrats are incredibly productive. But of course, what's happened, what I just described, is that today's meritocrats have created a world in which their skills are essential. So they have, in addition to increasing their own productivity, suppressed everyone else's ability to do without them. So let's ask a different way of thinking about how productive someone is. Let's look at the difference between the total output with or without the elite's labor. But now let's allow the rest of society to reorganize what they do in the absence of the elite. And in that world, you might have somebody who is extremely essential to social well-being, given the way society is organized now, but who prevents society from being reorganized in a way that would be better in their absence. And so the elite could, in fact, have a negative product, right? And that's exactly what's happening now. The gains that elite workers produce directly are much smaller than the indirect losses that they impose by preventing the rest of society from working, right? And so the meritocratic elite has bent the arc of innovation to favor itself. And in that sense, meritocracy is self-defeating because merit is itself a sham. Merit is an artificial construct built to launder otherwise offensive inequalities. The only reason why today's elite is so valuable is that it has reshaped work in its own image to make itself valuable, rather than because it adds something to any society in which it would work. So let me just end with 2 minutes, just a way of framing this. So here's a puzzle that economists, development economists have observed. Um, why is it the case that societies that are rich in natural resources, in oil and gold or in diamonds, are often very poor and unstable? The Democratic Republic of Congo is an example. GDP per capita about $550. Whereas societies that have fewer or even no natural resources are rich and stable. Singapore, GDP per capita $60,000. Now, I picked these two countries for two reasons. First of all, in 1960 or so, when both of them became independent, they had roughly the same GDP per capita. Singapore, interestingly, is the only country in the world today that acquired its independence involuntarily. It was expelled from Malaysia. Singapore didn't want to become independent, but Malaysia didn't want it, partly because it was worthless in 1960, but it has built itself up into an economic and cultural powerhouse. So why did that happen? Another reason I picked Congo and Singapore is that both of those were colonized societies. So it's not simply that colonialism explains the difference. Well, one explanation is what economists call the resource curse. Resource-rich countries focus on extractive industries, drilling and mining. Extraction concentrates wealth in landowners. It requires a large class of oppressed workers, and it discourages investment in education and the development of a middle class because the educated middle class threatens the landowners. A consequence of that is that there's an undermined democracy, there's corruption, and slow growth and political instability follow. Now, meritocracy, if the account I've just given is correct, has invented a new version of the resource curse. in which the cursed resource isn't oil or gold or diamonds, but it's human capital, the skill and training of free workers. The labor market in meritocracies increasingly concentrates work, income, and status in a narrow class of supereducated, superordinate workers. They dominate an underemployed and stagnating middle class, and they use its enormous income to buy schooling for their children that nobody else can afford and monopolize elite universities and top jobs in the next generation. So notice, this is exactly the same mechanism that I described a moment ago with extractive industries. Social stratification, undemocratic politics, and corruption and low growth follow. It's just the cursed resource isn't gold or oil, it's human training and skill. So meritocracy is self-defeating because it casts a human resource curse. Let me end with one reflection on the United States. In all of human experience, across all space and time, only 1.5 societies have managed to unwind high-end inequality, a concentration of economic privilege, as extreme as exists in the United States today, without violence, without losing a foreign war or succumbing to a domestic revolution. The glimmer of hope is that that society was the United States in 1929. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to stop the share so I can see people.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I'm sure there's lots of room for discussion here. So anybody that has questions, please feel free to either raise your hand using the function on Zoom or to enter your question in the chat box. And we'll be happy to discuss some of these ideas. And in fact, we want to encourage discussion of these ideas. We've purposely chosen to use this format so that we can have a lot of discussion.
Exactly. Please do. And also, if you're willing just to tell me a little bit about who you are and where you are, that would be great too.
Great. So let's start with Wenge Zhang.
Hello, my name is Wen. I'm looking. I'm in Seattle, Washington, and it's early
Oh
in
my
the
goodness,
morning.
it's 5:43 in the morning.
Yeah. I don't want to miss this important topic. And I graduated from UPenn, Ivy League school. But my major is education. So I studied higher
Hmm.
education at UPenn. And my question is, why the uh, Ivy Leagues like Yale or UPenn don't um, admit more talented students, uh, uh, and instead they run as a luxury brand, try to control how many students they can admit. For example, at Tesla or Apple, they are wonderful products, but if we want, we can buy them. But why we can buy high quality education as we want? Since
Yeah.
education is so important for socio-economic mobility. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me just add a couple thoughts to frame just how important this question is, and then I'll provide a contrast and I'll try to give an answer, but I'm not sure I have a good answer. Here's something really remarkable. If you look at the 10 or 15 most elite undergraduate colleges in the United States today, they are roughly speaking the same as the list was 100 years ago. And if you ask how many students they educate roughly the same number of students they did 100 years ago. Maybe it's a little more, maybe the list has changed a little bit, but they haven't grown anything like in proportion to the population of the country. And so what's happened is there's been a sort of an intensification of exclusivity, right? And as you point out, this is part of the institutional model of these schools. You know, if I think about just my own law school, here's how we run admissions. We begin with a number. We would like to admit roughly 200 students. We would like to enroll roughly 200 students. And our goal is to make ourselves so desirable that everybody whom we admit comes. So that in order to enroll 200 students, we have to admit 200 students. And in some sense, everybody whom we admit who doesn't come to us, we view as a failure. And so we want, in a way, to be as exclusive as possible. Now, compare this with Arizona State University, um, which is now one of the two or three largest universities in America. The way in which Arizona State University runs its admissions is it begins with a threshold. It asks itself the question, what does someone have to have done in high school in order to be able to benefit from a college education? Obviously, if you haven't done enough in high school, there's no point in your going to college. You're going to spend a lot of money and time and get nothing out of it. And so Arizona State asks itself, how good do your grades have to be? How good does your SAT have to be in order for you to benefit from an education at Arizona State? And then they try to admit everybody above the threshold. So their view is they want to maximize the number of people they admit. They want to be as unexclusive as possible. Completely different model of education. Now, obviously, it's not going to be the case that the Ivy League will adopt the Arizona State model because the threshold would be too high. But there's no reason why elite universities couldn't educate a lot more people than they do now. And this would, I think, be in the interest of society. It would also, interestingly, be in the interest of the elite. The elite doesn't think it would be in its interest because what the elite thinks is if we do that, we'll become less exclusive and our wages will go down and our degrees won't be worth as much. The thing is, once you're making the kind of money that graduates of elite universities make, the actual human value to you of another dollar of income is effectively zero. Whereas the value to you of a relaxing of the competition that dominates your life is very, very high. And so, in fact, if the elite became less exclusive, it would be good for the elite too, although it's not something I think the elite generally recognizes yet. Is that responsive? I don't know. You
Uh,
Yukon, you have a hand raised.
yeah, go ahead, you could.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Carol, and I'm currently in Beijing, but next year I'm gonna be a high school senior and I go to a boarding school in California. Um, so I was kind of wondering, like in this system of meritocracy that is existent in the US, what does it mean for like middle class or even lower class students who kind of like somehow like made their way into like these like elite forms of educations?
Good. So I think that there are two things I think I want to observe in response to that. The first is that class really exists in the United States. 20 years ago, U.S. Americans denied that class exists. It was an interesting feature of the U.S. that if you asked people what their class was, everybody said middle class. Everybody ranging from somebody who was a factory worker making $75,000 a year to a partner at Wachtell making $7 million a year. If you asked them what their class was, they both would say middle class. Um, and obviously, in some fundamental sense, that's not true. They have a very, very different relationship to wealth, the means of production, their own labor. And one of the things that's become plain over the past 20 years is that elite institutions have a particular class position and a particular class culture, and it's alien and alienating to people who enter them from outside of that class. And the institutions are starting to take some steps to make themselves more open and more welcoming to people who come from outside of the elite. In the same way in which these institutions, when they first admitted women or when they first admitted people of color, had to take steps to make themselves less alienating and less hostile to the groups that had previously been excluded, because these used to be male institutions and white institutions in a way in which they are less that now. And so the institutions are understanding that. And so it's a problem, and it's a problem the institutions are trying to deal with. A second quick observation is that, and this is important, we don't have systematic data yet. So I can't verify what I'm about to say with data, but I can say I'm quite confident it's true, which is that as it's become clearer to these elite institutions just how big of a problem class is for them, what they've started doing is they've started looking for deserving outsiders to admit. And that pattern has produced a significant, I'm not going to say dramatic, but a significant increase in the number of students at these institutions who come from a real lack of privilege, who come from, around the poverty line. But many of the places that have gone to those students have been taken from middle class students rather than from rich students. And you can see how this would work. If you want to go to Harvard College, there are really two ways to get in. One is to have an enormous amount of privilege, have your parents invest enormous sums in your acquiring all sorts of conventional markers of accomplishment and merit, so that you're fluent in many languages, you have done multivariate calculus in high school, you have worked at impressive charitable activities over the summers, and you get in based on that resume. The other way to get in without that resume is to show credibly that you've overcome significant hardship and disadvantage, that your parents had long periods of unemployment, that you were food insecure, that your housing was unstable, and that even though your resume is not as glittering as the first kid's, you've achieved what you've achieved against a background of real hardship. And that's another way to get in. The way not to get in is to do really pretty well in a pretty comfortable middle class setting. If one of your parents is a teacher, the other one of your parents is a firefighter, and you grew up in Peoria, Illinois, in a stable household, and went to the local school and did pretty well at the local school, you can show neither of those paths to admission. You haven't done something truly extraordinary because the circumstances in which you grew up made it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do something truly extraordinary. And you haven't overcome any hardship because you didn't face any real hardship. And so what's happening is the people who are admitted are starting to skew to the two extremes. And this is producing a world in the United States in which the middle class believes that elite universities are a conspiracy of the super elite and the disadvantaged against the middle class. And if you want to understand a significant part of the politics of the current attack on universities in the United States today, that's a really big driver of it. The stories about the sort of woke excesses and the culture war stuff is not irrelevant, but it's not nearly as important as the press and others make it out to be. The real thing that's driving middle-class Americans' hostility to universities is that they believe that their kids have no chance of getting in. And they believe that the elite universities are creating a labor market and workplaces that mean that their kids, when they become adults, will not have good jobs. And the thing is, they're not wrong about that. And so part of the issue for elite universities is how to change, not something on the side of a little bit of woke excess or certain kinds of academic freedom. Those things might be real, they might be important, they might be less real and less important, but they're not the center of what's going on. The center of what's going on is that these universities are promoting a form of social and economic life that disadvantages the large middle of society. And in a democracy, the large middle of society will take its anger out on elites that do that. And the universities need to find a way to change their business model so that they once again genuinely serve most of the societies in which they reside.
I want to be conscious of time, and I know we have three people that have raised their hands,
Shall
and
we
then
have the three people say something and then I'll just react to close?
yes, but before that, there's also a question in the chat box that I think dovetails pretty well with the discussion we were just having, and the
Yes,
question
good. I'll say
is
something about that. That's Carly Zhang's what kinds of education systems and methods would be suitable for coping the societal harms brought by meritocracy. So I'll say something about that right at the end also.
great. So let's have Xin Wang and then Tony and then Kate say your questions in order.
Hi, Daniel. This is Shin, and I'm from Xi'an. It's very famous for the terracotta. Now, here comes my question, because today is also the release of the entrance examination of China. We also call it Gaokao, and also I'm very interested in that, like in such standardized test seems to be a fair competition on the surface, but right now, actually it's more and more dependent on the family resources in essence. And also, for example, in learning a subject as medicine, it's highly dependent on your family resources. So I think that's also a kind of opportunity monopoly. And according to your book, I'm just curious about what kind of institutional design or educational policy can truly break this elitism and achieve substantive equality for opportunity.
Great.
So which path is more feasible and fundamental? Such as like downplaying standardized tests or fundamentally reconstructing the distribution of labor value. So that's my question. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you. Tony.
Oh, hi. Hi, thank you very much. I got a lot of insights from the talk. So my question is short. What do you tell to a sort of 18-year-old who spent their sort of a whole school years trying to get into an Ivy League school, but got rejected, but he felt like he deserved, like he got like 18 full scores on AP and a full score in SAT, but he saw that someone else got in, but he was equally capable, but he didn't get in, and he had some psychological issues. What do you say to them? Because I feel like I'm not gonna be able to explain the whole thing, but I want to sort of
Yeah.
counsel him in a way.
Yeah. And Kate?
Okay. Thank you very much for your informative presentation today, Professor. I'm a JD candidate this fall in Harvard School for law school. My question is very simple. You talk about like the recent Trump's actions towards the education department, and I wonder what's the interconnection between his policies with the meritocracy trap, that the topic today. Will his policy exacerbate the meritocracy trap? For example, the weakening of the mobility to the Ivy League school will certainly reduce this talent inflow, whether domestic or internationally. I wonder what's your opinion for that.
Yep.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. So there are a bunch of questions here. And then there's another question in the chat also about what my next book is likely to be about. So let me try to speak on three themes and then maybe we'll close. One has to do with structures, like what should we do to cure the ills that I've described? And the basic theme of my view on that is that it's a mistake to think that we can cure these ills while having elite institutions, both elite schools and universities, and elite workplaces remain as exclusive as they are. So right now, what these institutions are trying to do is they're trying to find deserving and talented outsiders to admit. And I think that that's better than not doing it, but it won't solve the problem. And that the problem is structural, and it has to do with just how exclusive these places are, just how dominant they are in our economic and social order. And so the only real answer is to democratize education and work and dramatically increase the number of places at elite schools and colleges and universities and change the way in which workplaces operate in order to promote mid-skilled middle-class jobs over elite jobs. And there are various ways of doing that. We could spend a lot of time talking about both, what are the incentives that government might give and what are the policies that the institutions might adopt. But for example, at the university side, I actually think the Ivy League should be admitting 2 to 3 times as many students as it's admitting right now. Just educating more students. And then all the way down the distribution of universities, more students should be educated. What that would do is it would make the competition to get in less intense. It would also produce a new labor force that would change the structure of employment in the middle term and produce a much more substantively equal society. So that's, I think, the basic theme is to promote more inclusive, more democratic, less exclusive institutions of education and work. What to tell the person who, tried their best, did really, really well, and didn't get in? I think it's really important across experiences of this system for everyone to understand. Almost none of what happens to you in this system is attributable to your own personal virtues. If you get in, it's not because you're great. If you don't get in, it's not because you're not great. It's a structure, and one feature of the structure is that at the super elite, the biggest determinant of what people's outcomes are is chance. When you have admissions rates of 4% or 3%, or my understanding is at the most competitive Chinese universities, you have admissions rates of 1% or less. What this means is that there are many, many, many times the number of applicants who would do well if they went than can get in. And from that large pool, people are chosen more or less at random. And so, if you don't get in, don't feel bad about yourself. If you do get in, don't feel good about yourself. And importantly, whatever your position is, understand that the reason the outcome is what it is for you is a structure of inequality rather than particular blameworthy people. In particular, in the US right now, it's not immigrants, it's not the woke left. In the US right now, the problem is not China. In China right now, China has its own issues of nationalism and exclusion. Those are not the real sources of this harm to individuals. The real sources of this harm to individuals are economic structures, which are damagingly concentrating privilege. In terms of just briefly, the next book I'm working on right now is a book called tentatively The Good Life After the Age of Growth, which observes that economic growth has transformed the human condition over the past 200 or 300 years, but for a variety of reasons, it's likely to end. And growth is a moral ideal, not just an economic fact. And when growth ends, we'll need a new organizing value and principle for our civilization. And the book asks, roughly speaking, how we should live our lives in a world after growth ends. And I have 2.5 years to deliver it. But listen, thank you, thank you, thank you for coming to this. It's been a huge pleasure to talk to people. I guess there's some people sitting in Beijing at the Yale Center. Is that right?
There are people in Beijing and all over the
Yeah.
place tuned
So
in.
I wish I could have been somewhere in person and actually met people in person, but I hope our paths cross in one way or another in the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Markovits, for a fascinating discussion, and we very much look forward to the upcoming book. I think that'll be a fun uh, a follow-up that we can do in a few years, hopefully.
Outstanding.
And thank you everybody for joining us
And
early
thank you,
morning, late.
Devin, for organizing all this. And I know it's an effort to put these kinds of things together, so I'm grateful to you.
I think everybody's very happy to join into this discussion, and so we thank you very much. Feel free to unmute yourselves, turn on your videos, say hi to Professor, and thank him in person, or thank you personally. And thank you all for joining us, and thank you also for CITIC. Just a reminder that this book is translated into Chinese and is available, so feel free to pick up a copy as well.
All right.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Good.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.